I mean, what do you think is the core of these kinds of dysfunctional family systems?
Avoidance. I think the core of narcissism, right? If and I think is the pathological inability to see outside of one perspective, and a family should be a shared perspective, right? Like going through a divorce, right, at the age of 7 should have been a communal experience, right? There should have been space made for the emotional, psychological complexity that would emerge in the children, but it was all about the adults. Like eventually I got sent to therapy by myself because I was angry, but it was all like, we don't know where these emotional problems are coming from. It's like, really? You don't know?
Mm.
I mean, it was like, I started wetting the bed and my mother beat me for wetting the bed, and it's like, all of it, from my perspective, even now as an adult, is very easily explained, right? Well, I was actually traumatized, right? That this is real trauma. Um, but nobody wants to. I mean, my dad literally gave me his move was like giving books. Like he gave me The Body Keeps the Score and then denies that, like read it in his book club or something, and then denies that trauma is part of my story. But that's
Mm.
the narcissist subconscious like admission of something, right? But then can't consciously acknowledge like, oh yes, I've been like the kind of missing variable in the story is the emotional reality of the children. My sister, on the other hand, like went more in the hyperfunctionality route. She was like older when it all fell apart, and so by like 16 she was living in France with AFS, where I was left as this kind of like plaything for my mother's emotional problem. It's
Mm.
just it all becomes a mess. And the scapegoat child, they call it the identified patient. I call it actually the identified feeler. That like the child that is deemed the scapegoat has to feel all of the repressed emotions that the family unit. It's like a toilet, basically. The child becomes just a receptacle for all the shit that they can't feel consciously. And it almost killed me. I mean, I mean, the scapegoat thing. Um, on the one hand, if you're scapegoated, it's usually because you're capable of still seeing the truth. You're seeing outside of the family system, but it can be such. The family system basically wants you sick or dead. I mean, it's really sick. And so I think in talking about this, oh, there's my cat. In talking about this stuff, it really makes it real. I mean, a lot of my start on social media came at a time where I was telling my story of being scapegoated, and it was cathartic to hear myself, to see myself speaking from my perspective, like speaking about what it felt like for me, like
Sure.
speaking about like I was a kid, right? I wasn't the one driving all of this dysfunction. I was the receptacle for it.
Right. And what was your mother's dynamic like with your father?
I don't really have many memories of them together. Like I don't have a single memory of them having a healthy conversation. But she claims it wasn't that bad. He was just like going to Europe with, he was just with other women a lot, And so my mother is um, very emotional, right? Very, very emotionally unstable. And my father is no emotions. And it was like being trapped between these two different kind of ways of dysfunction where they didn't communicate. And so all of that energy, like my dad basically just stopped talking to her once he left. And so all of that energy, like she would scream like, your dad doesn't love us, your dad doesn't give us money. And then I'd go ask my dad for something and he'd say, that's why I give your mom money. And so this little kid is like looking up at this dysfunction. And the only thing I can kind of interpret is, well, they seem to have money, but nobody wants to actually take care of their children. And it became this like the child becomes the battlefield, right? In the
Mm.
worst case scenarios. And so I think my mother got trapped in the miscalculation that the problem was my dad didn't parent us enough, but he's not capable. The problem was we spent any time with him at all. That he wasn't. We'd go on Saturdays and it'd be like we'd go watch movies, we'd go to Sam's Club, we'd go watch him get suits, but there wasn't like there wasn't parenting going on, right? And so um, it was all very confusing. Like I said, there's a reason like the children of narcissists understand narcissism is because we may not know what we're looking at, but we're experiencing it at all times. They don't stop being narcissists. You know, they are pathologically trapped, you know, in all of the ways that they are in other relationships with their children. I had a self-aware narcissist one time tell me he, quote, didn't do it to his kids. When I started pointing out how stupid that was and how ridiculous, he started making videos about how he abused his children, which I found to be ridiculous considering this guy has millions of followers. But, you know, the internet's a weird place.
I know who you're referring to. You don't mention any names unless you
Yeah.
want to, but
No, I have no need to. I mean, it was just eye opening, you know, and what he was trying to convey, I guess, is that they turn it on and off, and not the real narcissistic abuse, maybe the surface level behaviors, but they don't turn their narcissism on and off. They don't like somehow see human beings as human and other times only as objects. They always see human beings as objects. And if you only see your child as an object, that is child abuse from the minute they're born till the minute one of them you know, somebody's gone.
yeah, it's that operating system, right? If you
Yeah.
have that narcissistic operating system, they are not turning that off or on. It is
No.
always
It might be
influencing how they do
manifesting
things.
differently because people will point to like, well, when they go out in the world, they don't abuse everybody, but it's situational. Every relationship to them is transactional. So to somebody they're just meeting, they're nice because they're mapping the transaction. They don't need anything from them. They might be being nice to this person just to piss off their other person. You know, that if we're judging it based on that, we're missing the point of that of what narcissism is basically. And so the pathological kind, they don't turn it on and off. It's not possible, right? Like, and it really kind of drives me nuts when people look at that and say, well, he didn't do it to this person, but it's about the nature of the relationship they're in, right? It's not like they are operating on their own needs at all times, and they need different things out of different people, right? And it's but I think, you know, ultimately the healing is about, you know, we were talking about this earlier. It's like we fall victim to making all of the healing about understanding the narcissist, when ultimately what we have to understand is ourselves, right? And maybe we understand ourselves, especially when it's our parents, through the experiences that have shaped us. But I always say the most important pivot in narcissistic abuse recovery is when we pivot from what was done to us to what it means for us, right? To what does it mean for us? How has it shaped us? You know, how can we learn to see ourselves clearly, to love ourselves, to accept ourselves, especially in our faults, right? That it's not really about becoming an expert on narcissism, even though that's a fascinating topic, you know.
Right, right. I mean, what is the antidote to narcissism, in your opinion?
Authenticity and vulnerability. A narcissist can't be authentic. They're all mask, and they can't be vulnerable. They're all defense, right? And so the child becomes inauthentic and invulnerable. The child develops armor, you know, a lot of times anger as the armor, or you know, I think the children of narcissists have what I call counter confabulations, where, you know, a narcissist confabulates their past. The children of narcissists confabulate a reality where their parents care for them, right? They confabulate this reality that makes sense within the context of what the idea of a family is, even if it doesn't match its reality. And so the antidote to narcissistic abuse is learning to be vulnerable, learning to feel our feelings openly and share them, because it's never safe with the narcissist. You can't, they won't tolerate it, right? They will tell you how you're feeling. They will tell you what reality is. And so, you know, learning to, you know, and a lot of it is learning to be sad, learning to be angry, learning to be hurt. I mean, if they can't acknowledge that they're hurting you, they can't acknowledge your sadness. They can't acknowledge your trauma, because it tears down their distorted perception of the family unit. And so, you know, this is why shadow work is so important, because, you know, if we talk about shadow work as looking at the things we've repressed, the entirety of the authentic self of the child of a narcissist falls into the repressed zone, falls into the shame zone. And so it's not just our negative qualities, it's our good qualities too. Like, we need to learn to perceive ourselves. I work with so many successful people, right? and I know this in my life, I'm not successful, but we can't own our own success, right? Like their perception of themselves. There's this thing that's really hard for people to understand, that like narcissistic parents deny their children ownership over anything, over their lives, over their possessions, and most importantly, over their successes, over themselves. And so one of the common denominators is that people can achieve great success and still feel and perceive themselves as less than, as unworthy of the success. The success, the experience doesn't build the character or build the esteem that it does for other people, because we haven't had ownership over our own lives, right? And so this is where it gets kind of scary, because a lot of times when we learn ownership over our own lives, we're also owning our failures. That there's this kind of syndrome, I think, that happens in narcissistic abuse, where it becomes easier to have somebody controlling our lives in a certain way. And we get used to it on a subconscious level. And that when we start owning our lives, it becomes really scary to own our anger, to own our own dysfunction, to own the bad behaviors that have stemmed from, all of this stuff, because we all have them, but it's necessary. I mean, to truly overcome narcissistic parents is to cultivate an ownership over our lives, and to say, success, failure, whatever, it's mine, motherfucker. It's mine now, and I'm going to be myself, and I'm going to feel, without shame. I'm going to feel the things, I'm going to talk about the things that I've experienced, and to do so without actually shame.
Right. And that's the big thing with it too. In those dysfunctional families, emotional safety is not present. And then that always leads to disconnection, because
Right.
even if the parents say the right words in some cases, you don't trust them
No.
because you don't feel that emotional safety. In order for there to be trust, there also needs to be emotional safety.
Right. I mean, the biggest lie a narcissist ever tells is "I love you." Right.
Mm,
And so those words, I mean, I see this in my relationship. My girlfriend thinks those words kind of trigger me. And they kind of do, because it's, with a narcissist, you always watch what they say and watch what they do and see how they don't add up. But like as a kid, the entire culture, everybody is telling you trust your parents. Everybody is telling you your parents love you. And so what that does, you're right, it shatters trust in language. It shatters trust in self. It shatters trust in caregivers, right? Where it's a child like I mean, that idea of safety is so important, right? Like emotional safety. But what is it? Again, it's the same thing I think we were talking about with health. It's the ability to be yourself and be seen and loved and accepted as you are, with no transactions or conditions, right? That
mm,
like, an example from my life, like when my parents were getting divorced and there was all of this anger, it would have been an acceptance that, yes, we've put you through a situation where anger is part of the response. How can we work through this as a family, even if we're divorced, right? Not like, come back to me. My dad would say, come back to me when you're not angry. I'd go home and all the anger would spill out at my mother, and then I'd be punished. And it was just like this ping pong ball. And what would safety have been? It would have been being allowed to be angry. And
yeah.
then there wouldn't have been rage. There just would have been temporary anger at a situation that wouldn't have festered for decades.
Right. And certain emotions, they're just not allowed to be felt.
No.
Certain things are unacceptable. And I think that's why I really liked it when you had said CPTSD is kind of like a cork. And
Yeah.
maybe you could expand on that.
Well, right. And so, Mate describes psychological trauma as lacking an empathetic witness, right? And so we don't have empathy in our lives. And so anytime we display vulnerability or speak authentically, that comes from outside of the narcissist's delusional fantasy world. Anything that comes from outside of their fantasy world will trigger them. And so our real emotions trigger them. And so what that does is it puts this cork on our authentic self, where
Mm,
everything gets filtered through, we'll call it like a filter maybe. And it gets filtered through this unconscious question of, is it safe to be this? And nothing is safe. And so we become what they want us to be instead of what we are. And that cork, those trapped emotions, they don't evaporate. right? They just, it gets to a point where the cork pops and all of the emotions come out either, subconsciously or indirectly, or, directly. But it's, I mean, I was so angry. I'm just happy to be alive. I mean, I think when I started understanding the trauma and all of it came out, it was like holding on for dear life, basically, and like writing a lot. But really, like for me, it was just naming the anger. I remember in early recovery, I went to a woman, and I don't know what she technically does, but it would be a lot about getting into my feelings. It was called like wholehearted healing. And it would be like, what are you feeling? And I could never, I didn't know. I could never, I would just literally sob for like 3 months. I'd go there and sob, and she'd say, what are you feeling? And I literally didn't know how to name a feeling. And it was just like this cork, like this blob, like, and these things would just come out. And like, at that point, it wasn't even anger. It was just this deep, deep, deep sadness that when she would ask me how I feel, I would just melt into a puddle.
Hmm.
But even that was a lesson, was that, like, I think what that cork does, we talk about body dysmorphia, right? Which narcissistic parents give us. They're reflecting back a distorted version, but they give us life dysmorphia and emotional dysmorphia, where we don't really know what we're feeling. We just know that we have all this feeling, but it's so dangerous to feel it. That to me, like, I cultivated a practice of what I called emotional mindfulness early on, where I would just acknowledge if I was sad, I would write, I am sad.
Hmm.
If I was angry, I would write, I am angry. And I still have these little Post-it notes. I'd carry it around. And like, if I felt a feeling that I could identify, I would write it down and I would acknowledge it. I would bring it out of my internal experience. And something about writing, at least for me, makes it real. Like, it takes it and puts it, it puts it out into the real world. To me, that was me starting to build myself through the acknowledgement of my self state.
I think it's very important to be able to put words to our emotions and words to our feelings as well. And some people might say, well, you're intellectualizing your healing, but I like what you said, where now we have to understand it in our own terms so we can even get to the points where we're working through it.
Well, there's where Paracelsus comes in great handy again. Everything can be poison or medicine based on context or dosage. And so this intellectualizing trauma thing is a big kind of buzz thing right now. And I see both sides of it. I think specifically for the children of narcissists, the early phase is intellectualizing it, because we have to reclaim the narrative and reestablish the narrative from our perspective, right? And so there is an intellectual layer to it. But I also agree with the people saying you can't intellectualize your trauma, because the trauma exists somewhere in a different part of our brain than cognitive thought.